and I'll get started. So this week I'm going to go over vocabulary, and then next week I will go over the main ideas. So the first word that I think most of you are pretty familiar with by this point is sovereignty. So the most important things to know about this term is that it's not one thing. So this is not a situation where you go online and you look up one definition and that's the end of it. This is a very contested phrase. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So you have to understand it's a socially constructed context. Hopefully when you took your intro to sociology class, you talked about the social construction of reality. If not, I'll try to help you out here. Basically, if you look at this image on the right-hand side, you'll see basically three ways of constructing identities over time. So let's say 500 years ago, if you found yourself in England and you found yourself as a peasant in the fields, you understood clearly that sovereignty meant the king. And so if the king wanted to take your land, the king could do that because they were sovereign. If the king wanted to take your daughter, the king could do that because the king was sovereign. And so in this context, everyone is a subject under the king. And so it didn't matter who you were, it didn't matter where you were, as long as you were in the jurisdiction of the kingdom, you were a subject. So basically nobody was excluded from that structure of sovereignty. In this system, you had to obey. It was your duty to obey. If you didn't obey your king, then you were questioning the legitimacy of the sovereign, and you'd be in big trouble. You might die, you might not die. It's hard to say. But as capitalism starts expanding and merchants get more power in the 1600s, largely because of the slave trade, people started questioning this concept of having the king be sovereign. Largely because if you're on a boat and you own a bunch of human beings and the king has said that that's illegal, you might not want to follow, you might not want to obey your duty to the king. You might rather make money. And so as people are undermining the sovereignty of the king, there's a lot of kind of back and forth that goes on in England in particular, but also in Spain, Portugal, France. And you have people starting to kind of take into this idea that they should be sovereign, that if you are an individual with property, you should obey your king, but it's not, it's the moral thing to do, it's the right thing to do, but you don't have to do that. And this is where we start to get the idea of refugees and immigrants. And this is something you might have learned about in French theory. You might not have known it was a French theory, but it's called the social compact. That is not the English tradition. That's not the American tradition. That's the French tradition. But it was a pretty popular idea during colonialization in the 1500s and the 1600s. And this is where you get a lot of choice. People are deciding what they want sovereignty to be based on their economic position. And again, the right thing to do, the moral thing to do is to obey your sovereign, the king. But people are starting to push back against that idea and starting to say that they can have their own morals, their own rights. This was most pronounced in Germany in the rebellion against the Catholic Church and Martin Luther's 101 Theses against the Catholic Church, and what largely started Protestantism. Today, as you kind of find yourself in this kind of globalized environment where it's not so clear anymore who the sovereign is, most people, when surveyed, tend to think of sovereignty as majority choice, or the majority versus the minority. This is built on a lot of misunderstandings about voting and things like that. But they now see compliance as a personal choice. It's no longer moral or immoral. It's entirely up to you. And so that gets complicated now, and this is why we're looking at postmodern sovereignty. If everyone is in charge of their own life and they all get to make their own decisions, then how can you have a sovereign? In other words, if nobody's in charge, then how are you supposed to make this distinction? And so what people tend to think about is, well, if you are a quote unquote good citizen, if you're going along with the majority, then you're probably right. So you're probably sovereign. But what you see, especially in the quest for legal sovereignty, is people who have been excluded from the system, or the minority. So you could think of the Black Lives Matter movement, stateless people, undocumented people, people who are unemployed, a large group of people. They would not be sovereign under this majority rules concept. And so you have to see how the definition changes based on which group you're in and which time and place you're in. So we have these three stages, and we go through the pre-modern, which is king, and the king is a representative of God. That's obviously kind of a copy of the Roman Catholic situation. The more modern period that starts in the 1600s, where they shift that power over to the legislatures, and Congress, Parliament, and they still consult the king. And in our country, we consult the president. So in postmodern, it's tough to see because we have to analyze behavior. How do people behave? Who appears to be sovereign? I think a lot of people, when we were meeting in person, would say that the police were sovereign. This is before the murder of George Floyd, so you can see how attitudes may have shifted about that. But largely, people might say something like, the people with the guns are the ones who are in charge, based on analyzing behavior, not based on moral beliefs. So that's sovereignty, and again, you just want to remember that it's a socially constructed context, so the definition changes based on who you are. If you're an American Indian, you obviously do not have the same sovereign rights as Donald Trump. And so you kind of have to think about that context. And that would not have been true under the king as sovereign. Everyone would have been a subject. Okay. Jurisdiction, another tricky word. You'll find a definition in the quest for legal sovereignty. That's a good definition. Literally, in Latin, it means to speak law. And it really applied to people who were in the Roman construct. So they had a pretty open system for who got to be a citizen. And so if you they say when in Rome, act like the Romans. So if you spoke Latin, or if you were in the militia or the military, you were speaking within the jurisdiction, which meant you had the power of being a Roman citizen. That changed over time, obviously, but you can see there's a lot of phrases that we use in law and in everyday life that come out of this jur word, and jur being essentially law. And so you want to think about it as the legal power, right, or authority to hear and determine a cause of case or causes. The focus on this is not so much. A lot of students, if they get a textbook, they see subject matter jurisdiction. I think that's the end of it. That's not the end of it. But it is an important aspect. If you want to get divorced, you need to go to divorce court. You don't go to the Supreme Court. If you want to sue somebody in court, you don't go to criminal court, you go to civil court. And so this is subject matter jurisdiction, which is basically, are you in the right place? Did you go to the right court? It also has to do with, like, the IRS can't take your children away from you, right? That's a different legal structure. And so are they exercising the power and authority that they have been given? That's the other way to think about subject matter. There's also personal jurisdiction. And so if you commit a crime in Florida, then the jurisdiction is in Florida. You'd have to be transported back to Florida in order to be tried there. What gets complicated is if you think about jurisdiction in the more contemporary way, which is territory. So people tend to think about jurisdiction as the border wall in Mexico. Well, this is the difficulty, because I hope you heard what I said. The border wall is in Mexico. It's on Mexican land. And this is what makes territory difficult to even understand when we talk about jurisdiction. 500 years ago, jurisdiction was like a mountain. So if you were on one side of the mountain, you knew where you were. And then you went on the other side of the mountain, you knew where you were. But people didn't go to the top of the mountain and say, well, you're on the wrong side. And so now that we kind of do this strange territory jurisdiction, this becomes complicated because now that contradicts person jurisdiction. So we have a tendency to call immigrants illegal in this country, which doesn't make any sense because they wouldn't be subject to the jurisdiction of the laws of the United States. And if they were subject to the jurisdiction of the laws of the United States, that would make them residents or citizens, and then they couldn't be illegal. They'd be automatically legal, and there should be a process of giving them citizenship or residency. And so you see in America at this time, and over the last 20 years, we seem to want to have it both ways. That's a political, social problem. That is not a legal problem. There's no such thing as an illegal immigrant in law. There is, of course, the use of the phrase in politics. And this happens a lot. People who are talking politics are often wrong about the law. And so jurisdiction here is really about the right or the authority of the institution, whether that's Congress, whether that's the court system, the police. It's not about the individual or the groups of people. So that's something to keep in mind. It's about giving authority to an agency and limiting that authority to be to a specific subject over certain peoples, and in some situations, territory. The one that makes most sense, territory, is like maritime law, which is of the ocean. Right? Obviously, you're not going to probably ever experience that. But if you were involved in shipping or in those various industries that use shipping, then this would apply to you, and so that would be the court that applies. And so jurisdiction is really mostly about, are we in the right place, and are we talking about the right subject? Again, it's not usually used about people. Now, making sure you understand these terms, if you go to page 41 of the reader, then you'll find a definition and explanation of sovereignty as power. And what this really means is acting like a government. And so sovereignty, you see sovereignty. You don't really define it and describe it, you experience it. So when the IRS takes your money, they are sovereign, right? You realize in that experience that you are not sovereign. You thought you were free, you thought you had liberty, but you don't have your money and they took it, so clearly you are not sovereign. And so we use the phrase quasi-sovereign. You and I are quasi-sovereign. We have given up some of our sovereignty to these government agencies. Same thing with the police, right? People think they have constitutional rights until those are taken away from them. Well, you realize now that the sovereign is actually the police. It's not you. You thought you were, but you're not. And this is how we start to understand it. Governments do zoning, so this leads to gentrification, it leads to unequal development, property rights. They do taxes, right? Some people pay taxes. Rich people tend not to pay taxes. They pay accountants not to pay taxes. They use natural resources, so they take resources, whether it's your house to build a freeway or to build a subway line, or whether it's stuff that's in the ground, like shale natural gas, the water systems, oil, and they control the economy, the circulation of money, which our government does a lot of, the production. The United States took over the auto industry in 2008, for example. They've largely taken over the pharmaceutical industry in the COVID situation. Jobs, whether it comes to minimum wage, stimulus, right, that they give money out for unemployment benefits, things like this. The distribution of resources, and so this is where most of the government sovereignty occurs, in telling people how to get a business license, what you can sell, when you can sell it, when you can be open, all sorts of rules like this. And then also consumption, right? We're not allowed to purchase certain things. We're allowed to purchase other things. We're only allowed to purchase so much of something. And this is how we understand we've given up our sovereignty to these governing actors. And then I wanted to show you this map to kind of put in perspective. All of these territories that you see here with the blue lines, those were American Indian land. And all of those were taken away during the Jackson administration in the 1800s in something called the Trail of Tears. And so in the 1700s, these different tribes, and there was hundreds of tribes, they all had their own jurisdiction. They were treated like sovereign states. President Jackson took away this sovereignty, and that's where the phrase quasi-sovereign started to develop. In other words, you were only sovereign if you could defend yourself and act like a sovereign. The second that you're unable to, you obviously don't have sovereignty. So again, I'm just kind of repeating that we want to look at actions, not descriptions. The last two terms you have to understand clearly are liberal legalism, and this is, to be blunt, what most lawyers believe in. And you'll see it again in Quest for Legal Sovereignty. They express that it was in the best interest for non-white people to act and learn the ways of white people. This whiteness is not a skin reference. It is a cultural reference. So acting white in this concept, according to lawyers, would be behaving like the English and the Scottish Enlightenment in particular. So this is an emphasis on individual responsibility, on the Puritan hard work ethic, and a variety of cultural expectations that aren't always clear to people until you're told you're not doing it. And so there's a bias here, obviously, and lawyers definitely fall into this bias because this is how they were trained. And in this structure, in this bias, liberty, freedom, individual responsibility is more important than social responsibility. And so this is where you'll see inequality most prevalent, is because lawyers don't value equality. They value individual liberty. And what the lawyers are basically saying is that you should play along to get along. And this is a good example near where I grew up in Washington State on the Pacific Northwest. You'll see to one side to the right is the Yakima Indian Reservation. I did some work there. And then to the left, you'll have what's clearly the Washington government, the American government. And there's one sign for the reservation, and then there's like 4 signs of the Americans. And this is what we mean by jurisdiction and territory. One thing that governments do is they put up a lot of signs. You probably never thought about it, but New York City has signs everywhere. This is one of their ways of claiming authority, of claiming jurisdiction. You'll hear people complain, right? They didn't see a sign for parking, and so they think they don't have to pay the fine. Well, maybe you'll win, but probably you won't, because you don't have the same power that the city does. And again, this is about taking control of land in particular, but then changing people's behaviors on that land. So the last concept and term you need to understand is hegemony. And this is kind of the culmination or adding up those previous terms. So what people have to give up in a system where they are not sovereign is that you have to give up the way you talk, the way you behave, and the way you experience and value life. Otherwise, you're going to be excluded or harmed by the dominant social order. So if you go back to the system of sovereignty we seem to have today, where the majority power population, which is hard to define these days, but generally is called white, is very obviously excluding in politics and in social commentary other groups of people. And this is an example of hegemony. One group saying that their culture and their ways of living is superior and required for everybody else to get along. And so if you're not in that group, then you end up losing your collective identity, and by becoming an I, you now have to follow that path of individual responsibility, and that is often a losing battle. And so reducing collective groups into individuals tends to mean that you're going to lose most of your rights, because the rights were gained by social groups. And so the only way to kind of reclaim your identity would then be to reclaim your sovereignty. And so that's kind of how the system all works together and how those vocabulary terms work together. So hopefully that was pretty clear.